first peoples inhabited this land. This land was theirs. And they lived all over the Trinidad and Tobago. They were taken into encomiendas under the Spanish, which is the system of governance of the Spanish, and then they were placed into missions across the country. The first peoples, most of the roads that we traverse now, the major roads, were developed from trails that the first peoples would have come. The economy at the time, the economy in the early days when Trinidad and Tobago began, not as an independent state, but before that, the economy was agriculture. And it was the first peoples who contributed to the economy at that time because the mainstay was agriculture, cocoa, coffee, and other citrus and so that were introduced by the Spanish. So they made their contribution. When the Africans came, they had to piggyback on the development and the agriculture and the food of the first peoples because that is the only way they could have survived. So the first peoples made their contribution in many different ways. Times have changed, so the economy now is oil and gas economy. And while the original first peoples are no longer with us, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, their descendants still here. And they also work in the mainstream of society today, making their contribution. But much more than that, the first peoples have an inherent and unique relationship with the land, and they are not to be treated or seen as other members in the society looking for a handout, but the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples say that indigenous peoples have a unique relationship with the land and the environment. So on that basis, governments cannot look at first peoples on the same level as other groups in the society seeking some land or seeking something for something. They have a right, they have an inherent right as different to other members of the society. Not that they are better than anybody else, but because of their indigenuity, they have that inherent right that they have to be looked at as a different entity. And so governments throughout the world where there are indigenous peoples have recognized that. And such as Australia, such as Canada, such as the United States, they have recognized that and they are treating with their indigenous peoples in a different way to how the rest of the society is treated. The land that was given is 25 acres, and it was given as a lease. This is another thing that we will query. Indigenous peoples are not supposed to be given any lease. They are supposed to be given an allocation of land as a grant. A 30-year lease with the option to renew is not a security for first peoples. When this mission in Arima was established for the first peoples, there were no other peoples living in Arima. There was an indigenous group scattered all over in the forested areas of Arima known as the Mikoyos. When they brought the mission was established under the Spanish, the mission of Santa Rosa, for the Amerindians. To the tune, the governor at the time gave the church 1,320 acres of land, all in this area, for the Amerindians. And the law states that it was their inalienable right and property, meaning to say that the Amerindians themselves could not sell the land. It was held collectively by the church. Amerindians don't see land as collateral. All right? Today they might be seeing it so because it's security, land is security. But those days, and still today in some communities, land is held collectively. All right? So that 25 acres was given as a lease. We took it because we were anxious to start something, right? But we are going to ask the government to revisit that because that should be a grant of land. And we are now seeing that the 25 acres, because of some of the situation, because it's at the foot of a mountain, cannot be used for use. It has to stay in its original form. So we are now looking at the land that is bound into that, so that we can acquire that ready for some kind of a development and agriculture and so on. So that is the situation on the land, and we are learning now through research that is going on right now in the community that it was much more than the land number that I give you. By January, we'll have that research completed and we will make it public as to the correct amount. And while we are saying that we don't want back 120 acres of land, some people kill me for that because they say I'm too lenient. But I am practical. And in those days, the numbers that we had, we have much more now. So no one expects the government to look at take 1,320 acres of land for the indigenous community, but certainly 25 acres cannot work. It cannot work. One man in this country have almost 100 acres, all right, and they are foreign. They have come here and they have acquired that through whatever means. And the indigenous peoples have a right to their own space that is not limited by a lease and enough that they can do the type of development that they want to do. Today, the 14th of October 2020, marks exactly 20 years since the Santa Rosa First Peoples community were recognized by the then government as the legitimate representative of indigenous peoples in Trinidad and Tobago. Ever since that time, we have been observing this day of recognition with different events to mark this day of recognition. So we have had activities spanning over 5 to 7 days. This year, 2020, is an unusual year in that we are in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, we are not able to gather in numbers to have the different events as we are accustomed to in the past. But we are determined to mark this day of recognition with the very same rituals and ceremonies that we have been accustomed to, of course respecting the health protocols with the numbers that are allowed, so that we will have our various activities as doing our rituals at the Red House site, having our water ceremonies, assembling at the monument of High Arima in Arima on this very day of the 14th, and we will carry out our different observances. One of the first activities we have was held on the 12th of October at the Red House site. And you may ask why we go to the Red House. As most of you would be aware that in the renovation of the Red House, that the remains of First Peoples, or most of the remains that were found in the foundation of the Red House were that of the First Peoples, their human remains and other artifacts. As a result, we lobbied the government, successive governments, to allow us to have the reburial of these human remains on the very site. We were successful, and so we had a reburial with ceremony, indigenous ceremonies at that site.
Respect is something that is very important. We are taught to respect our elders. We are taught to respect the little ones. We are taught to respect the living. We are taught to respect the dead. We do not worship the dead, but we respect them and honor what they have done in their lives and what they have given us by paving the way for us to come. Oh, Yahweh, 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 Yahweh,
What is a water ritual and why a water ritual? Because the first people's spirituality is heavily based on nature and so closely connected with nature, one of the elements of nature, which is water, is highly respected and revered. Hence, we would find our way to some water course, either the river or the sea, and we would perform different rituals that will honor and praise the Creator for this element of water. Water is life. We have it within us. Without water, we cannot survive. And so we give the respect to the water. And we also pray for protection from this element of water, because just as it is necessary for our survival, it can be also destructive. So that we always pray that the Great Spirit will protect us from the destructive element of the water. And of course, the major activity for this year is this day, the 14th of October. In the morning at the Hayarima Monument, we would have different ceremonies such as the fire rituals and other songs, indigenous songs and dances in praise of the Great Spirit. These ceremonies are not to honor the monument that is erected there, but to remember the person that was Hayarima and what he stood for. He was an Ipuyo warrior chief who fought strongly for his people against the oppression of the colonizers towards his people. And it was on the 14th of October in the year 1637 that Hayarima attacked the town of St. Joseph, of course, with help from the Dutch that were in Tobago and other indigenous forces, to burn the town of St. Joseph, which was the then capital of Trinidad. And because of this brave act of resistance, we chose this day as we found it most appropriate as a day of recognition. And so we will celebrate the day. In the past, we have had, after the ceremony, a parade through the streets of Arima, and then we would have craft market, food stalls, indigenous foods, indigenous games and different items to attract the young people and to showcase the First People's culture. Because of the restrictions for this year, we cannot assemble and have all these activities, but at least we will go with the numbers that are allowed to have our observance and pay our respects for this day. We are on the site of the First People's Heritage Village. Where we are at present is the site that was granted by the government of Trinidad and Tobago for the development of the First People's Heritage Village. We have lobbied for this long because we felt that without a place to be identified as a home for our First Peoples, that all our efforts would be in vain. So on this site, it is proposed that many things will happen. We will recreate a traditional indigenous village where once you visit, you will be able to see actual food, indigenous food being prepared. You will see indigenous craft being manufactured. You will see some of the ways of life of our First Peoples, the traditional houses that they lived in, and for those who are younger and more energetic, they can climb the mountains, go to the nature trails and see the different trees and crops that the First Peoples used for their survival. This site is not in the first instance a tourism site. It is first and foremost to preserve and maintain the heritage and the culture of the First Peoples. But it will have a tourism spin-off. Both our local visitors and international visitors would want to visit a place like this. There is a curiosity, there is an interest by everyone to know something about our First Peoples. And so one cannot help but want to come to such an area, such a place like this. As a result of this, we call upon the authorities to give some priority attention to our efforts on this site, because it will certainly contribute to the focus and current efforts of the government in terms of tourism development and education, agriculture. We have at our center, out of the COVID season, hundreds of students coming to the center to gain knowledge of our First Peoples, some aspect of life of the First Peoples. And what they gain there is lectures, and they can see certain artifacts. But when this place is completed and operational, they can have a first-hand experience of what indigenous peoples are about and their way of life. So it is very important that the government, those in authority, those who can make it happen, give priority attention to see the development, the completion of at least the first phase of this First Peoples Heritage Site. We know that times are different. We know that times are hard. We know that the economy is not as buoyant as it was. But whatever resources we have, we now have to channel it in areas that will help not only our First Peoples but all our peoples to sustainability in food, agriculture, and of course, when COVID is over, in tourism possibly. I would like to take this opportunity to wish all peoples of indigenous descent in Trinidad and Tobago, and as far as they can view this production, a very happy and blessed First Peoples Heritage Day. Make a call again to all people of First Peoples descent to get involved, get interested, and support this most important cause. I thank you all very sincerely.
Come on, Coach Jessica, go!